Why agriculture is a point of contention in India-US trade talks. Despite soaring farm exports on August 6, U.S. President Donald Trump announced a second 25% tariff on Indian goods, taking the total duty to a staggering 50%, the highest rate India faces among major trading partners, barring Brazil. This move followed the collapse of long-drawn trade talks, which, according to Reuters, had stalled over one critical issue: access to India's agricultural market. The increased tariff is expected to disproportionately impact India's labor-intensive agri-exports such as seafood, spices, and processed foods, sectors that had seen strong growth over the past year. Washington has been pressing New Delhi to open up to a wider range of U.S. farm products, including genetically modified GM corn and soybeans, ethanol, wheat, poultry, and dairy. However, India has pushed back firmly, citing both cultural sensitivities and economic risks to its vast rural population. India's opposition to certain U.S. farm products is rooted in concerns over health, tradition, and politics. As per a Reuters report, most corn and soybean crops grown in the United States are genetically modified, a category India does not permit for human consumption. The report also notes that despite developing a GM mustard strain domestically, India has not cleared it for cultivation due to ongoing legal challenges. Resistance is equally strong against U.S. dairy imports, largely because of the Indian population's predominantly vegetarian dietary habits. A major concern is that U.S. dairy cattle are often fed animal byproducts, which runs counter to cultural and religious beliefs in India. Public opposition to GM foods in India is strong, with several civil society groups and farmer unions warning of long-term ecological risks and loss of seed sovereignty. India is also hesitant to allow ethanol imports for fuel use. Its current ethanol blending program is built around domestically produced sugarcane and corn, both to reduce energy imports and support local farmers. Allowing U.S. fuel-grade ethanol could depress domestic corn prices, particularly in states like Bihar, which is heading into elections and has a large corn-growing population. Officials told Reuters that opening the sector could trigger backlash, especially in coal-bound Bihar. Although agriculture contributes just 16% to India's $3.9 trillion economy, it remains the primary source of livelihood for nearly half of the population. Food inflation is a key driver of voter sentiment in India, and basic food items account for almost half of the country's consumer price index. India learned a hard lesson from liberalizing its edible oil market 3 decades ago. After it opened up imports in the 1990s, the country became heavily dependent on palm oil supplies from nations like Indonesia and Malaysia. Today, it imports nearly 2/3 of its vegetable oil demand, as per Reuters. Officials now fear a repeat scenario if other staples such as grains, pulses, and dairy are open to global competition. A sudden flood of cheaper American imports could crash domestic prices, hurt smallholder farmers, and lead to political unrest. The memory of the 2021 farmers' protest, which forced the government to roll back 3 farm laws, remains fresh in political minds. There is also concern that a trade deal with the U.S. could set a precedent, forcing India to grant similar access to other countries under most favored nation provisions, a WTO rule that bars countries from offering selective trade benefits without extending them to all members. After Trump announced additional tariffs on Indian goods, Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Thursday pushed back, asserting that India would not compromise on the interests of rural communities despite external pressure. India will never compromise on the interests of its farmers, livestock rearers, and fishermen brothers and sisters. I know personally that I will have to pay a heavy price for this, but I am prepared for it, Modi said. The remarks, seen as a direct response to Washington, reinforce New Delhi's hardened stance on trade negotiations, particularly its refusal to open up sensitive agricultural sectors. And that's the paradox. While talks are stuck on agriculture, bilateral agri-trade is growing faster than ever before. According to U.S. Department of Agriculture data reported by the Indian Express, India's imports of agricultural products from the U.S. rose by 49.1% year-on-year in the first half of 2025, from 1.13 billion in June 2024 to 1.69 billion in the same period this year. US agricultural exports to India could cross 3.5 billion this year if current trends hold. India's farm exports to the US are also booming, up 24.1% in the same period, from 2.79 billion to 3.47 billion. Projections suggest India's agri-exports to the US could top 7.7 billion by year-end. Yet this growth is uneven. India's exports are more diverse, led by high-value items like seafood, especially frozen shrimp, spices, rice, processed foods, and essential oils. In contrast, the US exports a narrower band of goods, dominated by tree nuts like almonds and pistachios, ethanol, cotton, and soybean oil. Ethanol and soybean oil, although derived from GM corn and soybean respectively, are allowed into India for industrial purposes but not for direct fuel blending or human consumption. India's biggest agri-export to the US is seafood, especially shrimp. In 2024, Indian seafood exports to the US were valued at 2.48 billion, second only to Canada, according to the Indian Express. But with Trump's new 50% tariff, India now faces a disadvantage compared to competitors. Chile faces only a 10% tariff, Ecuador 15%, Vietnam 20%, and Canada 35%. The 32.5% year-on-year growth seen in seafood exports during June 2025 may not sustain if this tariff gap widens further. Reuters reports that Indian officials are concerned that these tariffs could reverse gains in segments like processed foods, spices, and rice, sectors where small and medium enterprises dominate the supply chain. According to figures published by the Indian Express, India exported 6.21 billion worth of agricultural products to the US in 2024, compared to 2.38 billion imported from the US. The export-import gap is wide and growing, but this does not mean India holds all the leverage. In fact, the US has significant influence in tariff setting and could extend its pressure beyond agriculture to other sectors if talks remain deadlocked. Interestingly, soybean oil exports from the US to India have surged in 2025 after India slashed import duty on the product from 27.5% to 16.5% on May 31. This, however, was a calibrated move aimed at tempering domestic inflation rather than signaling any long-term policy shift. Nanan swipe left for next video. The irony is inescapable. At a time when US-India farm trade is on track to hit record highs, it is agriculture that is holding the larger trade deal hostage. This contradiction is explained not by trade logic but by domestic political compulsions, cultural factors, and long-standing distrust of foreign influence in food policy. Trump's tariff hike may force some tactical concessions, but on the core issues, the stalemate is likely to persist, unless one side redefines its red lines. Until then, both sides risk escalating trade tensions further, with India's export sectors bracing for volatility and the US facing limited access to one of the world's fastest growing food markets. Latest vlogs.